Your entire cohort fled from battle. The enemy was overwhelming, and survival instinct kicked in. Now you're standing in formation while your centurion walks down the line counting. Every 10th man is pulled out. You watch as your tent mate, the man you've served with for 5 years, is dragged forward. The other 9 men in his group are handed clubs. They have orders to beat him to death. If they refuse, they die too. This is decimation, and it's how Rome built the most disciplined army in history. Welcome to Chapters in History. Today we're revealing Rome's system of military discipline so brutal, it made soldiers fear their own officers more than they feared the enemy. Hit subscribe, because this is Roman military justice at its most terrifying. Let's discover why Roman legions never broke. Chapter 1. Roman military dominance wasn't built on superior weapons or tactics alone. It was built on iron discipline, enforced through a system of punishment so severe that Roman soldiers would rather die fighting the enemy than face their own commander's wrath. This wasn't arbitrary cruelty. It was a calculated system designed to eliminate cowardice, enforce absolute obedience, and ensure that Roman soldiers functioned as a machine rather than a collection of individuals. The Roman military justice system operated on a simple principle. Collective punishment creates collective responsibility. If one soldier's cowardice endangered the unit, the entire unit would suffer. This meant soldiers policed each other, creating peer pressure more powerful than any punishment an officer could inflict alone. The punishments ranged from minor humiliations for small infractions to immediate execution for serious offenses. But the most infamous punishment, decimation, was reserved for ultimate failures like mass desertion or cowardice in battle. It was so brutal that even Roman commanders hesitated to use it, knowing it could destroy morale as easily as restore discipline. Today, we're exploring the complete system of Roman military discipline, from the minor punishments that kept soldiers in line daily, to the horrific death penalties that ensured Roman legions would hold formation, even when facing certain death. This is how Rome manufactured courage through fear. Chapter 2. The Hierarchy of Punishment. Roman military discipline operated on a graduated scale. Not every infraction resulted in death. That would have depleted the legions too quickly. Instead, punishments were carefully calibrated to match the severity of the offense, creating a system where soldiers always knew exactly what consequences they faced. For minor infractions, being late to formation, poor equipment maintenance, minor insubordination, soldiers faced castigatio. This was public humiliation and corporal punishment. A centurion would beat the offender with his vitis, the vine staff that symbolized his authority. This wasn't a gentle tap. Ancient sources describe severe beatings that could break bones and leave soldiers unable to perform duties for days. The beating was deliberately public, conducted in front of the offender's unit. This served multiple purposes. It humiliated the individual, demonstrated the centurion's authority, and warned others not to commit similar offenses. The psychological impact of watching your comrade beaten bloody for a minor mistake was profound. For more serious offenses like sleeping on guard duty, a crime that endangered the entire unit, the punishment was FUSTUARIUM. The guilty soldier would be sentenced to death by beating, but with a horrific twist. His own tent mates had to carry out the execution. The 8 men of his concubinium would be handed clubs in order to beat him to death. This punishment was psychologically devastating for everyone involved. The condemned man was killed by his friends, men he'd lived with, fought beside, and trusted. The executioners had to choose between killing their friend or facing the same punishment themselves. The watching soldiers understood that their own tent mates might be forced to kill them if they failed in their duties. Desertion carried an automatic death penalty, but the method varied by circumstance. Soldiers caught deserting before battle might be beheaded quickly. Those who deserted during battle and were recaptured would face crucifixion, the most shameful and painful death Rome could inflict. The body would be displayed outside the camp as a warning to others. Theft from fellow soldiers was treated with extreme severity. Roman military law recognized that trust between soldiers was essential for unit cohesion. A thief who stole from his comrades might be beaten to death, or in some cases, sold into slavery, a fate that meant losing citizenship, honor, and any hope of military pension or retirement land grants. Chapter 3. Decimation, the ultimate terror. Decimation, decimatio, in Latin, was the most infamous and terrifying punishment in the Roman military arsenal. It was reserved for the most serious collective failures, entire units that fled from battle, cohorts that mutinied, or legions that showed mass cowardice. The word itself means removal of a tenth, and that's exactly what it was, a lottery of death. The process was ritualized and deliberate, designed to maximize psychological impact. They would be forced to draw lots, typically sticks or stones, with one marked stick in every group of 10. The man who drew the marked lot was sentenced to death. But here's where the true horror began. The other 9 men in that group, his tent mates, his friends, the men who had fought beside him, were given clubs and ordered to beat him to death. They had to do it themselves. If they refused or showed mercy by striking weakly, they would be executed as well. So they beat their friend to death with full force, knowing that hesitation meant joying him. Ancient sources describe decimation scenes in graphic detail. Livy and other historians recorded men begging for mercy, crying out to friends who had to ignore those pleas and keep striking. They described the sounds of clubs breaking bones, the groans of dying men, and the psychological trauma that lingered long after. The survivors, those lucky enough not to draw the marked lot, weren't spared entirely. The entire decimated unit was often punished further with ignominia. They would be forced to camp outside the main fortifications, exposed to enemy attack. Their rations would be changed from wheat to barley, animal feed rather than proper food, marking them as less than true soldiers. They would be assigned the most dangerous duties until they could prove themselves worthy of restoration to full status. Decimation was rare precisely because it was so extreme. Commanders understood that killing 10% of a unit and psychologically destroying the other 90% could break a legion permanently rather than restoring discipline. Ancient sources record only a handful of decimations across centuries of Roman military history. Julius Caesar reportedly used decimation once, though accounts vary on the details. Marcus Licinius Crassus famously decimated units during the Spartacus slave revolt, punishing soldiers who had fled from slave armies. Mark Antony decimated cohorts that fled during his Parthian campaign. Each time, the punishment achieved its goal. The units never fled again, though some soldiers were so traumatized they were never effective fighters afterward. Chapter 4. FUSTUARIUM. In detail. While decimation was rare, FUSTUARIUM was the standard execution method for serious individual offenses, and it occurred with disturbing regularity. The procedure was carefully structured. When a soldier was sentenced to FUSTUARIUM, the sentence would be announced publicly to the entire cohort or legion. The condemned man would be brought forward, and his crime would be stated clearly, so everyone understood exactly what action led to this fate. Then came the psychological torture. The condemned soldier's own tentmates, his contrabanales, would be ordered to carry out the execution. These 8 men had shared quarters with him, eaten with him, fought beside him. They knew his family, his jokes, his fears. Now they had to kill him. The execution would take place in the camp's central area, where the entire unit could witness. The condemned soldier couldn't fight back or resist. Doing so would only make things worse for his tentmates. He had to stand or kneel while men he considered brothers beat him to death. The clubs were standard military equipment, heavy wooden staves that could break bones with each strike. The first few blows might crack ribs or break arms. As the beating continued, the condemned man would collapse. Even then, the beating continued until he was definitively dead, a process that could take several agonizing minutes. For the executioners, this was its own form of punishment. Ancient sources describe soldiers who carried out FUSTUARIUM being psychologically destroyed by the experience. This was intentional. Rome wanted soldiers who would follow orders no matter how horrific. The witnessing soldiers absorbed their own lessons. They saw that the Roman military system was inescapable. You couldn't save your friends even if you wanted to. Your loyalty to your tentmates had to come second to loyalty to Rome. Personal relationships were subordinate to discipline and orders. Chapter 5. Execution for cowardice. Cowardice in battle carried an automatic death sentence, but the circumstances determined how brutal the execution would be. A soldier who panicked momentarily might face FUSTUARIUM, but a soldier who fled deliberately, abandoning his post and endangering his unit, faced something worse. The most shameful execution was crucifixion. This wasn't just death, it was public humiliation, designed to strip away every shred of dignity. The condemned soldier would be stripped naked, beaten, and then nailed or tied to a cross outside the camp, where everyone could see. Crucifixion deaths took days. The soldier would hang there, fully conscious for most of it, experiencing excruciating pain as his body slowly shut down. Other soldiers would pass by, seeing their comrade dying slowly, and knowing this could be their fate if they showed weakness. The body would be left hanging after death, often for weeks, decomposing in public view as a constant reminder. Birds would feed on the corpse. The smell would permeate the camp. This visceral reminder of cowardice's consequences was more effective than any speech about bravery. Some commanders used even more elaborate executions for particularly egregious cowardice. After major battles, commanders might hold public trials of soldiers who had fled. These would be theatrical events where the accuser's cowardice would be described in detail. Witnesses would testify about how his actions endangered others, and the verdict would be pronounced before the assembled legion. The condemned would then be executed in whatever manner the commander deemed appropriate, sometimes beheading for quick deaths, sometimes burning, sometimes being thrown to wild animals if the army had captured any during campaigns. The variety served a purpose. Soldiers never knew exactly what punishment awaited cowardice, creating uncertainty that multiplied fear. Chapter 6. Collective Punishment. Beyond decimation, Romans employed various forms of collective punishment designed to make entire units responsible for each individual's actions. This created powerful peer pressure that prevented problems before they started. If a century performed poorly in battle or training, the entire unit might be punished with extra duties, reduced rations, or forced marches. They would be assigned the worst positions in camp, closest to the walls where enemy attacks were most likely. They would dig the deepest latrines, perform the hardest labor, and receive the least desirable food. The ignominia disgrace was a specific form of collective punishment. A disgraced unit would be forced to give up their wheat rations and receive barley instead. This was deeply symbolic. Wheat was human food, barley was animal food. Being forced to eat barley marked you as less than fully human, as degraded in the military hierarchy. Disgraced units were also forced to camp outside the fortifications. While the rest of the legion slept safely behind walls and ditches, the disgraced unit would sleep exposed, vulnerable to enemy raids. This created constant fear and discomfort, while also making them the first line of defense against any attack. The psychological impact of collective punishment was profound. If one man's mistake could result in the entire century being punished, soldiers policed each other viciously. They would beat or ostracize any soldier who seemed likely to cause problems. This system meant that by the time an officer needed to intervene, the problem had usually already been addressed by peer pressure. Soldiers feared disappointing their comrades more than they feared enemy armies, creating self-enforcing discipline that required minimal officer oversight. Ancient sources describe cases where soldiers would kill their own comrades who seemed likely to cause collective punishment. A soldier who repeatedly made mistakes might simply disappear during a battle, killed by his own unit to prevent further problems. The Roman command structure understood this happened and tacitly approved. It was discipline enforcement without requiring officer involvement. Chapter 7. The centurion's vine staff. The physical symbol of Roman military discipline was the centurion's vitus, a vine staff about 2 feet long that every centurion carried at all times. This wasn't just a badge of rank. It was a weapon used daily to enforce discipline through pain. Centurions had broad authority to beat soldiers for any infraction. Being slow to formation, having dirty equipment, showing disrespect, moving improperly in drill, any of these could result in an immediate beating. The centurion didn't need to report to higher authority or conduct a trial. He simply started hitting, Ancient sources describe centurions as brutal enforcers who ruled through fear. Some earned nicknames based on their cruelty. One centurion was reportedly called "Bring Me Another" because he broke so many vine staffs beating soldiers that he constantly needed replacements. Some soldiers died from beatings. Though this was technically illegal, centurions weren't supposed to kill soldiers through punishment, only discipline them. But the line between discipline and murder was vague. If a soldier died from a beating several days later due to internal injuries or infection, was that murder or just unfortunate consequences of proper discipline? Roman military law was deliberately ambiguous, giving centurions enormous discretionary power. This created a command structure where soldiers feared their own officers more than they feared enemy armies. You might survive a battle, but you couldn't escape your centurion. He was always there, always watching, ready to deliver immediate painful punishment for any failure. The system worked because it was consistent and predictable. Soldiers knew exactly what standards they had to meet and exactly what would happen if they failed. There was no ambiguity, no possibility of arguing or appealing. Fail to meet standards, receive beating. Chapter 8. Why it worked. The Roman discipline system seems horrific by modern standards, but it was brutally effective at creating soldiers who would maintain formation and follow orders even when facing certain death. Several factors explain why the system worked. First, the punishments were immediate and certain. There was no lengthy appeals process, no possibility of avoiding consequences. Failure led directly to punishment, creating clear cause and effect relationships that shaped behavior. Second, the collective punishment system created peer pressure that was more powerful than individual fear. Soldiers weren't just afraid of being punished themselves, they were afraid of causing punishment for their friends. This transformed discipline from an external force imposed by officers into an internal social dynamic. Third, the system was applied consistently across all ranks with some exceptions. While officers faced different specific punishments, they weren't immune to discipline. Commanders who failed could be removed from command, publicly humiliated, or even executed for particularly serious failures. Fourth, the extreme severity of punishments paradoxically required them to be used less often. Because the consequences of failure were so terrible, soldiers worked desperately to avoid triggering punishments. Decimation was rare, precisely because the threat of decimation kept soldiers from deserting. The system worked through deterrence as much as actual enforcement. Finally, the Roman system offered rewards alongside punishments. Soldiers who performed well received bonuses, promotions, better positions in battle, and social honor. The discipline system wasn't purely negative. It existed within a broader structure that rewarded excellence as much as it punished failure. Final chapter. Rome's discipline by death system created the most effective military force in the ancient world. By making soldiers fear their own commanders more than they feared enemies, Rome built legions that would hold formation against impossible odds, follow orders without hesitation, and maintain discipline even when winning seemed hopeless. The human cost was enormous. Thousands of Roman soldiers died not from enemy action, but from their own military justice system. Countless more were psychologically scarred by watching friends beaten to death, or being forced to execute comrades themselves. But from Rome's perspective, the system worked. For 500 years, Roman legions dominated battlefields across 3 continents. They maintained formation under conditions that would shatter other armies. This system couldn't exist in modern armies bound to single-scale, intimate, and scorn movement. But understanding it helps us understand how Rome conquered the world, not just through better tactics or equipment, but through a discipline system so brutal, it manufactured courage from fear and turned ordinary men into soldiers who would rather die fighting than face the wrath of their own centurions. What's your take on Rome's brutal discipline system? Necessary evil or excessive cruelty? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to Chapters in History. Next time, we're exploring the Roman decimation of the 9th Legion and whether it really happened. Until then, remember, Rome conquered the world by making its soldiers fear their own commanders more than death itself.